Hi everyone, my name is Noah Fenton, and I'm a computer science major at the University of Pittsburgh. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss how web applications work, the problems with static content, and why serving content dynamically can solve a lot of those problems. But at the end of all of this, we're going to realize that we need to do both of these processes together to create our wonderful web applications. So web application operates in two distinct locations. The first is on the end of the user. When developing web applications, often the first question we ask ourselves is, what should my users see? And to facilitate these user side of things, programmers write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. Now, all these languages are interpreted inside of the web browser, and the web browser then renders a well-designed, user-friendly web page that you have created using your code. And the process of providing code to the web browser happens in a second location, a web server. Now, while a server might seem complicated to some of you, a server is really just a special computer that receives and distributes information for your web application. You can set up a server to run on your laptop, or you could purchase a small computing unit like a Raspberry Pi, or even use corporate-level server solutions provided by companies like Google, who provides the Google Cloud Platform, or Amazon, who provides Amazon Web Services. The exchange of information between server and browser is also incredibly simple. Your browser makes an HTTP request to the server, which in ordinary terms is just a request for the HTML, CSS, or JavaScript files that are needed to render the web page. And there are several different types of HTTP requests, but really the one that we're focusing on is just kind of getting these files from our server. And in case the idea of these HTTP requests is a little bit unclear, think about it like an email. So we've all emailed files back and forth between colleagues. And an HTTP request is kind of just an automated version of that file exchange over email. Instead of having to hit the send button whenever we type something into our URL in the URL field of the browser, then that kind of just automatically we get a reply with our files that we need to have a web page. Now, for new developers or even non-computer science web designers, the idea of sending files back and forth is simple enough. You might think that all you need to do is just code up the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript files. And in some cases, you really only need one of those three. But if you want to have a robust web application and something that's going to be successful, something that you can tailor specifically to an individual user, you're going to have to create a different file for every single user. And is that something that we really want to do? Well, that's what the problem is with static content and with this approach. As the name suggests, static content does not change. It's the same for everybody all of the time. And to do anything unique or to change the content for the users, you'd have to manually create additional files and add additional routing for every single different HTTP request that you could ever see from any different user. And if your system has only a handful of users, like 2 or 3, perhaps you could get away with this idea. However, for our practical purposes, you're going to have thousands of users and need to generate tailored content on the fly. And we call this process dynamic content. To provide your browser with dynamic content requires additional work to developing your server. Instead of just sending the file directly to the browser, we also have to perform what the industry refers to as a business logic. And this means you have to either operate on your data, fetch data from another source, perhaps customize your data a little bit, or just do anything else that's necessary before sending back your newly generated files to the web browser for rendering. Now, the use of dynamic content solves our problem of having to create unique web pages for every single user and all their specific needs. We can process information unique to each user and provide them the best experience possible, giving our application a major boost from the original static content approach. Additionally, dynamic content allows us to assemble web pages from databases. Consider something like YouTube, where thousands of videos are uploaded every day. We don't want to be manually editing HTML files every time a video is uploaded to have a link. And we also don't want to have to physically upload a file onto a hard drive to kind of represent our YouTube videos that are getting uploaded. Instead, we can use dynamic content to pull and set data, our database, and add new videos, or receive new videos as soon as the user requests it, and populate an HTML file that is relevant to that particular user. So there are several different frameworks that are used to serve dynamic content, and all of them are in several different programming languages. Popular frameworks include Flask, which uses Python, Spring and Spring Boot use Java, and then .NET for C# is another very popular framework. To create a web application that uses dynamic content requires learning one of these languages and frameworks, which can take several weeks if you are not already acquainted with computer science. However, in order for your application to take off and be successful, you're going to want to invest the time because static content on its own just can't get the job done. Now, there are a few drawbacks to serving content dynamically all of the time. For starters, dynamic content is significantly slower to generate, depending on how complicated your business logic is on the back end. Static content, the file is already prepared. And dynamic content requires us to assemble the file to some extent before sending it back to the user. And for this reason, developers often house things that don't change very often in what we call the static directory. Everything inside of the static directory is naturally served statically. Normally, developers store images, downloadables, and sometimes CSS files inside of the static directory. This is not only faster on the server side due to not needing any business logic, it's also faster due to this thing called caching. And caching is a very popular topic in computer science, although we can just kind of focus in on it and how it works for our web applications in the browser. So caching occurs inside of the user's browser, and the browser saves static files from the static directory onto your personal laptop. And this makes the retrieval of those files significantly faster than they would be if you were doing things over the internet to contact your server. Now, of course, you'll see problems rise again with this issue whenever you update your static files. Sometimes I might want to have to change an image or change a CSS file, and I need to update that. But if it's already cached for the user, how can I get them to see this update? Luckily, this problem is already resolved, and it's actually very straightforward through a process called cache invalidation, which just means our server will send a message to the browser saying, hey, clear out the cache for us, so that way our user can have these new files. So in summary, we've seen that static content alone is not sustainable for any practical web applications. Dynamic content provides a solution, but it's not always the best for every single circumstance. The best applications use the two content serving types in harmony to create an incredible user experience. That concludes today's presentation. I want to thank you all very much for watching, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below and I'll answer them as soon as possible. Thank you all again.